collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Coming up on the programme this week, we talk to the Cyprus Institute about a study conducted into the benefits of integrating green policies in COVID-19 economic recovery. It's just been published by the World Bank and it will be presented at the next climate change conference in Glasgow later this year.
I think that things are changing. Of course, they are not changing at the pace that our environment demands, because it seems that there is unprecedented global action, especially to mitigate climate change, needed urgently.
And having been floated by British Foreign Minister Dominic Raab, could the power-sharing model used in Northern Ireland for their peace accord be used successfully in Cyprus?
They invite every political party to be in the cabinet on the basis of their electoral strength. So they have a formula, and according to how many votes you get, you're automatically entitled to be part of the governing coalition.
Where is the economy going post-COVID-19? Well, there is the possibility of green recovery measures. According to a report by the Cyprus Institute that's been published by the World Bank, energy upgrades of buildings and enhanced sustainable mobility are just some of the ideas being floated. The lead author of the report is Associate Professor in Energy Policy, Theodoris Zachariadis. He joins us now. Theodoris, thank you very much indeed. It's almost a question of where on earth do you start when you're looking at the possibilities of economic recovery after the last 12 months or so?
You're right. It's difficult to think where you should start. But of course, because we want to be useful to policymakers and not just propose ideas that may sound very good but not very realistic to implement, we would suggest that we start from policies and action plans that the policymakers are familiar with. And this means green measures that are already included in documents and strategies such as the National Energy and Climate Plan that every EU member state has to submit. Or in the case of non-EU countries, there are climate risk assessments, there are submissions to the United Nations about climate change mitigation measures. So we would say that policymakers should start from measures that they are familiar with and that they know are possible to implement. From that point onwards, there is a question how to prioritize different kinds of measures.
And of course there's cost, which is where I think the recovery plan of the European Union and its funding for green answers may well come into play, won't it?
Yes, indeed. And the European Recovery Plan, which is supported by the EU Green Deal, which was already announced before the pandemic, offers a great opportunity to cover some of these costs of these green measures through complementary funds from the EU. So there is a large number of possible measures, and the EU's priorities are also to a very large extent green, because they are aligned, as I said, with the EU Green Deal. So realistic measures with a green component are worth examining.
Can you go through some of the measures and explain to us what sort of things you want to implement? I mean, I mentioned energy upgrades of buildings, but that's something I think we've started to do in Cyprus, but it's very slow.
Indeed. We started several years ago, and there have been national and EU funds in support of this. They are slow, but they are slow almost everywhere, because it is difficult to engage many building owners, especially if they are multifamily buildings, and many businesses to be involved in such renovations, because they need also to finance these renovations. It's not only grants that can cover the whole costs. So this is relatively slow, but we hope that this can be accelerated through specific financial mechanisms that are now available and through the additional EU funds. So that's one kind of green measure that is worth pursuing to a large extent, and we have examined.
And sustainable mobility was mentioned. There we lag a long way behind the rest of Europe, don't we?
Indeed, and this is the greatest problem. It is recognized by decision makers because the lack of sustainable mobility, which means less use of private cars and more use of walking, biking, but more importantly, public transport modes, is a main barrier that hinders progress towards reducing the emissions and improving air quality in our cities. So this is also quite a difficult measure. It's not as easy as the electrification of vehicles that the market will pursue to the extent that there are EU policies and global policies that encourage the auto industry to proceed towards electrification of vehicles. But sustainable transport modes, especially public transport, is very difficult, requires public interventions, takes time because it has to do with mentality, it has to do with costs, it has to do with behavior, and the lack of progress in the last decades in Cyprus discourages policymakers from taking this very seriously. We have very good studies right now with sustainable urban mobility plans for each major city of Cyprus. And I can trust these studies that they are very, very good, and they have a specific time plan for implementing different measures. But still, they need funding, they need political willingness to go through, and they need time to yield benefits.
So that doesn't look as if it's going to be, in a sense, on the front burner. What else can be done, though, that will have an impact, not just on the economy, although I know that's what you were looking at, but on the social infrastructure? Because cleaner air is good for the health service, it's good for every citizen, and so on. So there are wider implications, aren't there, to some of these ideas?
Exactly. And we have tried to capture some of these wider implications because we looked not only in effects of different measures on economic growth and jobs, which are important, of course, extremely important, but also on issues related to air quality, issues related to waste management, and also issues related to social acceptance and social equity. Some of these criteria cannot be quantified as easily, but that's why we also took a dedicated workshop with stakeholders where we elicited their opinions and then did a specific analysis of their views. So indeed, sustainable mobility is perhaps the measure that improves many social aspects. As you mentioned, it's public health because it has to do with air quality, with noise and accidents, for example. There are other measures as well that improve the overall social welfare. For example, the modernization of the electricity grid through the installation of smart meters in all electricity consumers. This may not be a very fancy measure, but it is a prerequisite to allow faster penetration of photovoltaics, for example, which again would improve also the air quality because we would need much less fossil fuel burning power stations to produce our electricity.
So how did you go about doing this study? Because there are so many different areas. You mentioned that you talked to some stakeholders, but were there questionnaires? How did you actually go about gathering the information?
Well, because we focused on green measures, we had some of the information available from the previous governmental action plans, which we also contributed to. For example, the National Energy and Climate Plan or the Long-Term Decarbonization Strategy, which are documents and studies that were prepared for the European Commission. So we had such information available to some extent. And then we employed a combination of models, computational models that we have, energy and economic models, to assess the effects of individual measures on energy consumption, emissions of air pollutants and greenhouse gases, and also on jobs and economic growth. But there were also other aspects that we would not have in our models, And that's why we needed the opinions of experts. But not only experts, but also civil society organizations. Issues that are related to the social acceptance, to equity considerations, to possibilities to improve the infrastructure or the productivity of enterprises. So these are all impacts that we could not directly model, but we took the opinion of some experts, policymakers, but also people from the private sector and people from NGOs.
And of course there are people across the world who are doing similar work. I wonder how Cyprus-specific some of these things are, because you can get best practice from a lot of other countries, but they don't always work in different regions, do they?
That's why we need the opinion of stakeholders, which also reflects their experience over the last years of what works and what does not work in our national setting. This is an important aspect. There have been several studies around the world, indeed. What the World Bank people liked in our approach, and that's why they collaborated with us and published the report, was that it is a relatively simple approach that is close to policymakers. So you don't need very sophisticated models. You depend much on stakeholders' input, and you are also closely related to what policymakers are familiar with. And that's why the results of this study will also be included in a report that will be launched next week of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which tries to link the Sustainable Development Goals with the EU Green Deal and the EU recovery plans. Because it is quite straightforward to understand as an approach, and because it could be applicable to many different countries, not only in the EU, but also around the world.
And I think it's going to be part of an event during the Global Climate Conference in Glasgow. I think that's in the autumn of this year. When you go to big events like that, what do you get out of it that you can bring back to Cyprus?
We try to learn as much as possible. So that, as I said in the beginning, we want to be useful to policymakers. We, as researchers and academics, can do our work and can be satisfied with what we publish, or less satisfied, or disappointed, or proud. But because those of us who are working on policy issues, and especially on environmental policy issues, want to be useful to policymakers, and we don't want our work to be trivial and to be irrelevant for them. So we try to gather as much international evidence as possible, best practices from other countries, and we hope that perhaps other countries may learn something from the best practices that we propose for Cyprus.
Right, final question, because you mentioned very early on in our chat that political will was all important, and that does seem to be something that is rather lacking in Cyprus when it comes to anything that's considered possibly to be slightly unpopular, with people who may have to perhaps fork out some money in order to implement these. How seriously do the authorities, and I don't just mean the government here, I presume with a lot of these things it's also the local authorities, how seriously do they take this sort of work, and do they come back to you in terms of advice as to how to implement it?
Well, I would say that they take it quite seriously because indeed some of the strategies that have been formulated in the last years that have to do with energy renovations, with environmental action plans, etc., are based on our work. And we are also currently collaborating with the University of Cyprus on providing an approximate impact assessment of the measures to be submitted by the Republic of Cyprus to the European Commission for the recovery plan. So I think that it would be unfair to say that decision makers do not care about this. And I think things change because people's behavior change. Civil society is becoming more active and aware. There are several very concrete and strict commitments of the Republic of Cyprus as an EU member state. So I think that things are changing. Of course, they are not changing at the pace that our environment demands. because it seems that there is unprecedented global action, especially to mitigate climate change, needed urgently. So things are not moving that fast around the world and in Cyprus too. But on the other hand, we have to be optimistic and try to be as useful as possible in order to accelerate the transition.
Well, let's hope that your report on the benefits of integrating green policies in the COVID-19 economic recovery do indeed bear fruit. Theodoros Zachariades, Associate Professor in Energy Policy at the Cyprus Institute, many thanks for joining me.
Many thanks for inviting me.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
Recent visits to Cyprus by the foreign ministers of Greece and the UK ahead of a touted five-way conference being called by the UN Secretary-General to see if the Cyprus problem can be moved forward, well, it's brought up some interesting thoughts. Over the years, regular listeners will know that we've often talked about Northern Ireland's power-sharing model, and that, once again, has been brought up reputedly by Dominic Raab when he was over here. So what does it involve, and would it work in Cyprus? Well, my next guest is Neophytos Loizidis. He's a Professor of International Conflict Analysis at the University of Kent and Director of the Conflict Analysis Research Centre there. Neophytos, thanks for joining us. You have lived in Northern Ireland, you've worked in Ireland and Northern Ireland, so can you put a bit of background information in for us to start this off with how you think we could possibly extrapolate their model and make it work in Cyprus?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I worked for 5 years. I taught at Queen's University Belfast for 5 years between 2005 and 2011. At the time that this model was implemented in Northern Ireland. This is one of the classic parliamentary systems, unlike ours, presidential system, and unlike what is discussed so far in the Cyprus negotiation. My understanding that the recent UK proposal is something in the lines of a Northern Irish Belgian system, a parliamentary system, which is, I would say, the most logical solution. Most power-sharing models tend to be parliamentary. We don't have cases of presidential power-sharing system in Europe, with the exception maybe of Bosnia, which is very presidential. So it's a common sense. It's the most logical and standard model to be thinking across those lines.
Can I just interrupt you there and say, would that require a change to the constitution of Cyprus?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole settlement would require a change in the constitution. And it's an opportunity. I mean, countries change their constitutions all the time. They change their political system. It's very uncommon for a country not to have constitutional amendments. And one shouldn't forget that Cyprus is the only presidential democracy, pure presidential democracy, in the European Union. So we are the exception, and by adopting a parliamentary system or a semi-presidential system, if we go according to the proposals, what we have seen in the suggestions by Dominic Raab, we will be returning back to normality, if you wish. We're becoming a normal EU country. The fact that we're presidential is the anomaly. It's us standing out in the European Union. The only country that comes close to us is France, but it's semi-presidential, with very clear separations of power between the Prime Minister and the President. And there are countries like Spain who have presidents, but they're actually Prime Ministers. They just call them presidents. Sometimes countries do that. They call their Prime Ministers presidents. South Africa does that. So we have an opportunity through the settlement of the Cyprus problem to rethink of the fundamental ways of governance in the island. And judging from what is said in the literature, what is said in the international experience, presidential systems do not function as well as parliamentary systems. This is conventional wisdom. Political scientists have been writing about that for decades. And now, when our students come to the first year in university, the first thing we teach them is the perils of presidentialism. An article by Juan Lins in the 1990s arguing that parliamentary systems are way superior to presidential systems. And Cyprus stands out, the only country, as I said, in the EU who has a presidential system, and these kinds of proposals gives us opportunity to rethink this fundamental anomaly in our political system.
Well, we can rethink our fundamental system, but then we have at the moment the Turkish Cypriot leader Ersin Tatar and also the Turkish government floating the idea of a two-state solution. So how does that pan into this whole idea of power sharing? It doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, someone might say it's not connected because in order to start talking about power sharing, right, you need to accept the fact that you go back to a federal arrangement. If there's two-state solution, then each side will decide its own political system. But there is a fundamental connection there in the following sense. There was a system, a proposal that was agreed by Christofias and Talat. And that proposal was a presidential system with cross-voting. Now, Talat and Christofias agreed on that formula. As moderate leaders on the left, they could rely on each other's vote, and therefore every future government in Cyprus would be favored. The left would be favored by this electoral system. And at the time, parties like this did not necessarily oppose the idea. They thought themselves they could make alliances, but people like Eroglu and the party that Tatar represents today, they absolutely hated the idea. They absolutely hated the idea because they knew that they will never get elected. Nobody will vote for Tatar in this kind of electoral system. And it will be in the language of a UN mediators. It will be a system like, for them, it will be like Turkish voting for Christmas. They will never accept anything like that because it will keep them permanently out of the political competition because their competitors would rely on Greek Cypriot votes. So that was the thinking at the time. The Northern Irish proposal resolved this problem. Because in the Northern Irish proposal, I remember in the negotiations, there were all parties. And these parties, some of them, knew that they would never be part of coalitions because the others wouldn't accept them as coalition partners. So what they have done, it was a very simple innovation. And this happens in many occasions. Just Northern Irish, notice here that it's not just the Northern Irish model that uses something like this. They enable, they invite every political party to be in the cabinet on the basis of their electoral strength. So they have a formula, and there are different ways we can go to the specifics of the formulas, because it's not one, it's several. And according to how many votes you get, you're automatically entitled to be part of the governing coalition. You can choose not to be part of it, but if you wish to be part of it, then you're represented. In this way, you safeguard proportionality, but you safeguard effective participation. So you meet several benchmarks at the same time.
But is it sustainable? Because we've had problems in Northern Ireland with the UK government, if you like, taking over the power there because there have been problems with the power sharing model.
Sure. I mean, there will always be problems in any electoral system. No system could guarantee full levels of functionality. I mean, our current, if you take it as a factual, I mean, right now we're a community of only Greek Cypriots and we elect a president, and we have a highly dysfunctional system. We have a president with so much power that creates issues of corruption, lack of accountability. I mean, you have a president, you have a government, right? But the government is not functioning properly. So in other situations like Belgium, because you cannot form a coalition, sometimes you have a period of technocratic governments or minority governments, the previous government staying in power. Those are very normal in political systems, and this type of short-term crisis, the politicians stay behind. You have a technocratic government or an outsider making the decisions for a while, and then parties return back in a couple of months or in a year's time, and then they form the coalition. And part of having crises of this type is very normal when it comes to political systems. The question is whether you have some kind of fallback mechanism to ensure that during those periods you have a smooth running of the state. In the case of Cyprus, it will be much easier than in Northern Ireland because the majority of the decisions, the daily decisions, will be taken by the constituent units anyway. So there will be moments of crisis which are inevitable, unavoidable in this type of solutions, but those will give also the opportunity for political parties to reflect on their weaknesses and adapt accordingly.
That takes political maturity, which isn't terribly evident in Cyprus.
Well, in Northern Ireland started from a much lower situation. I mean, in Northern Ireland, there was a solution that followed up a period of high polarization and also a period where the sides still used to kill each other, and with very little political experience as well, because the parties in Northern Ireland were not functioning in a proper system. They were not in power. There was at least one party that was essentially a military organization, and others were also linked to military groupings. So we're talking about situations, not only Northern Ireland, but in general, where military groupings who have blood in their hands, recent blood in their hands, we're talking about months of a gap between them being involved in military hostilities and them entering power sharing. And this often works. In Cyprus, we didn't have any of these for decades now. So if we're talking about maturity of the political system, both the Greek and the Turkish Cypriots have already established democratic institutions, organized parties, a high level of economic development that guarantees some kind of stake when it comes to the decision making. I wouldn't worry as much. I mean, comparatively speaking, I wouldn't see Cyprus as a problematic case. In all political systems, you have some default mechanisms to resolve conflicts, and crises are essential to the maturity of the system. So the second proposal by the British government was that of Belgium. And a lot of people are very concerned that in Belgium there was a similar issue, that they didn't have a government for more than a year. But it's misleading, because it's not about not having a government to begin with. The previous government stayed in power, so they had minority support, and every time they went to the parliament said yes to all the decisions they have proposed. And during that period, if you study those periods of so-called no government, the state functions more or less in the same way. Sometimes even the rates of growth, if you take those as indicators, are higher than normal. So these crises are essentially in a political system. I wouldn't worry as much about those when it comes to that. I would be more worried about political systems such as ours, meaning the Cypriot one, where you elect a president. The president is untouchable for 5 years, and during those 5 years, the president loses public support, and it becomes dysfunctional. So you have a figure in Proedrico, in the presidential house, but that figure doesn't matter. That cannot have a meaningful presence in politics. So this is more problematic.
We have to wrap this up now. Do you think that this idea from the British government and Dominic Raab can be floated at the five-way conference, or is it just going to be more blah blah?
Well, here what I would do if I was a negotiator, the more options you have on the table that are workable. I mean, these proposals are within the workable range of alternatives. It can be the Belgian, it can be the Northern Irish, it can be some kind of a Swiss presidential council. We can go back to the idea of Kalat and Christofias. The more options we have that seem workable, the more likely it is to agree on the issue of political equality, on the issue of the chapter of governance.
It does, of course, mean that first and foremost you have to accept the federal model as a solution, and that is far from writ in stone at the moment. And of course, as we said, the political will. We really have run out of time, so I have to cut you off now, I'm afraid, Neophytos. But it's a very interesting thought, and we will look forward to hearing what happens at that five-way conference, and whether or not after all these years of chatting and negotiating we can actually move forward on the Cyprus problem. Many thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.